I never thought that one simple decision could snowball into such a complicated mess. It all started when I finally achieved something I had been working toward for years, buying my dream car. To most people, it might have seemed like just another car, but to me, it was so much more. It was a symbol of everything I had worked for, a result of long hours, tight budgets, and personal sacrifices. At 27, I was proud of what I had accomplished, and I was finally able to treat myself. It wasn't a luxury car or a super expensive sports car. It was a well-made, reliable, and sleek vehicle, just the kind of car I had always admired. It wasn't about the price tag. It was about the sense of accomplishment that came with having earned it. I was excited, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had something that was truly mine, something I had worked tirelessly for. The day I brought it home, I was practically beaming. My family had gathered at my parents' house for a get-together, and I figured it was the perfect time to show off my new purchase. My parents were thrilled for me, and most of the family congratulated me. But then, there was Eric. Eric is my 24-year-old cousin, the kind of guy who always seems to be on the edge of trouble. He's the wild one in the family, the one who never really grew out of the bad boy phase. He'd often play the role of the life of the party, cracking jokes and making everyone laugh. But it was clear to most of us that there was a lack of maturity there. We all kind of tolerated it, just writing it off as part of his personality. To put it simply, Eric was that cousin. You always wondered how he managed to get away with things, but nobody ever really called him out. From the moment Eric laid eyes on my car, I could tell he was more interested in it than he let on. I wasn't surprised. He was always the kind of person to make everything about him, but I thought it would just be a passing interest. Still, I decided to let him have a look at the car, figuring it would be a brief moment of admiration. Instead, it turned into an annoying series of requests to drive it. I had just gotten the car, and the last thing I wanted to do was let someone else behind the wheel, especially Eric, who had no regard for other people's things. I politely told him no a couple of times, in fact, but Eric wouldn't let up. The more I declined, the more persistent he became. He started cracking jokes about me being too protective of my new car, claiming I was acting like I owned a Ferrari instead of a regular sedan. He even made snarky comments about how I should loosen up and let people enjoy it. He was being annoying, but I chalked it up to him being Eric. I didn't think much of it, until he did the unthinkable. I was talking to a few other family members inside when I noticed my car was missing from the driveway. At first, I thought I'd just forgotten where I parked it, but then the realization hit me. Eric had taken my car without permission. I couldn't believe it. I rushed outside, calling his name, and sure enough, there he was, cruising down the street in my brand new car like it was his. My heart sank. There I was, standing in my own driveway, helpless, watching him speed off with something I had worked so hard for. I wasn't just angry, I was furious. The betrayal stung like nothing I had felt before. How could he think it was okay to just take something that wasn't his? Especially after I explicitly told him no. What made it worse was how casual he seemed about it. It was as if the whole thing was some kind of joke to him. When Eric finally returned, there was no apology, no remorse, nothing. He got out of the car, threw the keys at me and muttered, "It's just a car, man. Relax." That was it. No acknowledgement of the fact that he'd taken something that didn't belong to him. No apology for potentially wrecking it, just that dismissive remark. I stood there, staring at him, in complete disbelief. I tried to hold myself together, but the anger was building up. "You can't just take my car without asking?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What the hell is wrong with you?" His response was just as dismissive. "It's just a car. Calm down. I didn't wreck it or anything." He turned to walk away like it was the most normal thing in the world. I was livid. I couldn't believe that Eric, who had been such a reckless person his whole life, was now trampling over my boundaries and laughing it off. To him, it was no big deal. To me, it was everything. It wasn't just about the car. It was about respect, about understanding that actions have consequences. I wasn't about to let him off the hook this time. That night, I went home seething with anger. The way Eric had treated me, the way he just brushed off my feelings, it wasn't something I could let go of. I had worked so hard for that car, and he had completely disrespected me and the effort I had put into getting it. I knew I had to do something. But what? Was I really going to let him get away with this? It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about standing up for myself, about making sure Eric faced the consequences of his actions, no matter how uncomfortable that might be. The next day, I started seriously considering what my options were. Should I talk to him and try to work it out? Or should I take the drastic step of involving the law? I wasn't sure at first, but I knew I couldn't let this slide. I took the time to reflect on it, and after discussing it with a few close friends, I decided I was going to take action, and I wasn't going to let Eric walk away without being held accountable. The first step, though, would be talking to a lawyer to see what my options were. But deep down, I already knew this wasn't going to be a simple family dispute. It was going to be a fight, and I was ready for it. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Eric had done. It wasn't just that he had taken my car. It was the complete lack of respect he showed for me and my hard work. I couldn't let it slide. I had spent years saving, sacrificing, and putting in hours of overtime to buy that car, and Eric had acted like it was no big deal. It wasn't just about the car, though. It was about accountability. I knew I had to make him face the consequences, even if it meant shaking up the entire family. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It wasn't like I could just forget the situation. Eric didn't even show the slightest bit of remorse. He had laughed it off, tossed the keys back at me, and acted like I was overreacting. The way he dismissed everything, it made me feel small, like my feelings didn't matter. It wasn't just the loss of the car that stung, though. It was the principle. I had set a boundary, and Eric completely ignored it. What bothered me the most was that he didn't even apologize. If he had come to me and admitted he messed up, I might have let it go, but he didn't. And on top of that, I found out through family gossip that he had been bragging about what he did on social media, mocking me and my overreaction like it was some kind of joke. That was it. I couldn't let him get away with it. I spent a few days wrestling with the decision. It wasn't going to be easy. I knew if I went down the legal route, I was going to cause a massive rift in the family. Some of them, especially Eric's parents, would never forgive me. But I wasn't doing this for the money, and I wasn't doing it to hurt anyone. I was doing it because it was the right thing to do. I wasn't going to let anyone, not even family, trample on my sense of self-respect. I sat down with a lawyer who specialized in civil cases. After hearing me out, he told me I had a solid case. The damage to the car was severe, and Eric had no right to take it without my permission. What really solidified my decision was when my lawyer brought up the emotional distress I'd experienced, how I had been left feeling disrespected, violated, and completely helpless. It wasn't just the financial hit from the damage, it was the emotional toll that was harder to put into words. I felt a little guilty, but the more I thought about it, the more I knew I had to take a stand. Eric had made a mockery of my hard work, and had acted with complete disregard for me as a person. The lawyer said we'd have to gather evidence, and that was when things started to get serious. I began documenting everything. I gathered texts, screenshots of Eric's social media posts where he made light of the situation, and even a few messages from relatives who were supporting me. I wasn't planning on making this a public spectacle, but I knew that if it came down to it, I would need all the evidence to back up my case. It wasn't just about the money, but it felt like I was being forced to make a stand in a way I never had before. Eric was known for getting away with things. His parents often made excuses for his bad behavior, as if it was just part of who he was. They'd always been quick to defend him, turning a blind eye to his recklessness. I knew I'd have to face them too, if this went to court, but I was ready. I couldn't let this go. As I moved forward with the lawsuit, the tension in my family started to rise. I didn't want to be the one to stir the pot, but I wasn't going to be the one who let Eric slide just because he was family. Some relatives took Eric's side, of course. They said I was overreacting, that it was just a mistake. But others, people who knew how hard I'd worked for everything, started to see the situation for what it was. They were on my side, which gave me some comfort, but the worst part was yet to come. Eric wasn't just avoiding accountability, he was actively mocking me. He posted more online, laughing about the situation, and even made a joke out of the lawsuit. He turned it into this absurd game, like everything was just one big joke to him. It made my blood boil to see him act like that. What he didn't know, though, was that I was serious. I wasn't playing around. I was going to hold him accountable no matter what it took. Eric wasn't the first person in my family to make light of my achievements or my feelings, but I was determined to make sure he wouldn't be the last. The days leading up to the court date were nerve-wracking. It wasn't just the legal stuff that weighed on me, though. It was the fallout. I knew this was going to strain my relationships with family members. Some would understand, others wouldn't. I couldn't predict how things would play out, but I had come to terms with the fact that I couldn't let my fear of family drama hold me back anymore. I had to do this for me. I had to hold Eric accountable. I had to show him that actions have consequences, and that I wasn't someone to be disrespected or walked over. No matter what happened next, I was ready to face it. The fight was just beginning. I had made the decision, and now there was no turning back. Once I filed that lawsuit against Eric, I knew the ripple effect would be huge. It wasn't just about the money, though the cost to repair the car was certainly part of it, but about making sure someone finally took responsibility for their actions. I wasn't willing to let Eric off the hook. He needed to face the consequences of what he had done, and I was the one who had to hold him accountable. The process was daunting. I had never been through something like this before. Legal jargon was a maze I had to navigate carefully, and the thought of taking someone I considered family to court felt surreal. But every time I thought about backing out, I'd remember that Eric had taken my car, wrecked it, and laughed it off. His attitude made it clear that he didn't think there were any real consequences for his actions. He thought it was all a joke. The family split was immediate. Some relatives, including a few cousins and a couple of aunts and uncles, saw things from my perspective. They knew how much that car meant to me. They saw Eric for what he was, immature, reckless, and entitled, and they supported my decision to seek justice. But the majority of my family, especially Eric's parents, had a completely different view. They were furious that I'd taken the issue this far. According to them, I was overreacting, and I should have just forgiven Eric. To them, this was a trivial matter, a boys will be boys situation. I didn't care. No matter how much Eric's parents tried to minimize what had happened, I wasn't going to back down. I had to do this for my peace of mind, and for the principle of holding people accountable. Eric wasn't exactly making this easy. Instead of being embarrassed or apologetic, he had taken to social media to mock me. His posts were full of jokes about the lawsuit, about how I was being dramatic over something that was clearly just a mistake. He even posted a video where he acted like I was the unreasonable one. It was infuriating. The more he posted, the more it became clear to me that he had absolutely no remorse. His behavior just proved to me that I was doing the right thing by taking legal action. I started gathering evidence for the case, screenshots of his social media posts, texts from relatives who had witnessed his behavior, and even statements from a couple of family friends who had seen how Eric had handled the situation. The lawyer I was working with told me that the more evidence I had, the stronger the case would be. I made sure to document everything: his disregard for the damage, the fact that he never even offered to help pay for the repairs, and the way he continued to make a joke out of everything. At the same time, the tension in the family grew. Family gatherings became a battlefield. Eric's parents would argue that I was being too harsh, telling me that I should let it go for the sake of family peace. Meanwhile, I was being bombarded with messages from people telling me that I was making a scene and dragging family drama into the public eye. I wasn't concerned about public opinion, though. I had made my peace with the fact that some people wouldn't understand. I wasn't going to let anyone tell me what I should or shouldn't do. This wasn't just about a car. It was about standing up for myself. It was about proving to Eric that actions have consequences, and that I wouldn't be his punching bag or a doormat anymore. As the court date loomed closer, I felt a mix of anxiety and determination. I knew I was right, but I also knew that going to court meant dealing with a lot of stress. Eric's lawyer, who I had heard had a reputation for being ruthless, would do everything in their power to try and discredit me. I had to be prepared for the fight of my life. The morning of the court hearing, I felt like my stomach was tied in knots. As I walked into the courtroom, the weight of everything hit me. I had spent so long getting ready for this moment, and now it was finally here. I couldn't afford to let nerves get the best of me. I had to focus. When Eric walked into the room, I could feel the tension rise. He didn't look remorseful at all. He looked like he was still treating this whole situation as if it were some game. His posture was defensive, and he refused to make eye contact with me. I didn't let that throw me off. I focused on the facts, on the evidence, and on the principle of what I was doing. The first few hours were exhausting. My lawyer and Eric's lawyer went back and forth, trying to make their cases. Eric's lawyer tried to paint him as the victim, claiming this was all just a prank that had gotten out of hand. It felt like they were grasping at straws, but I had prepared for this. My lawyer countered with the hard evidence, the photos of the damage to my car, the social media posts Eric had made mocking the situation, and the witness testimonies from those who had seen how Eric had treated the matter. The turning point came when Eric was forced to take the stand. He stammered through his responses, clearly uncomfortable as my lawyer presented more and more evidence that contradicted his story. His attitude throughout the whole process was dismissive and arrogant, and it made me realize how out of touch he was with reality. When the judge pointed out his lack of accountability, Eric's cocky demeanor started to crack. It was obvious that he had no real defense. As the day wore on, I felt more and more confident. This wasn't just about the car, it was about teaching Eric a lesson and making sure my family saw the truth of the situation. Eric's actions were inexcusable, and now he was going to face the consequences. The trial ended with both sides presenting their closing arguments. Eric's lawyer repeated the same tired defense. This was all just a prank that went too far. Meanwhile, my lawyer emphasized the real financial and emotional costs that I had to deal with, and the principle of holding someone accountable for their actions. The judge listened intently, then called for a short recess. As I sat there, waiting for the verdict, I couldn't help but feel a wave of exhaustion hit me. The fight had been long, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but at least I had stood up for myself. I had done what I needed to do, and no matter how this played out, I could hold my head up high. The recess felt like an eternity. I sat there, staring at the empty chair where Eric had been sitting moments before, trying to collect my thoughts. The weight of everything, the lawsuit, the family drama, the endless arguing, had drained me. But in that quiet moment, I felt a sense of calm. I had done everything I could. I wasn't going to back down. The door to the courtroom opened, and the judge returned to his seat. The moment of truth had arrived. He adjusted his glasses, scanned the room, and then looked directly at Eric, who was sitting with his parents, arms crossed tightly across his chest. After considering all the evidence presented, the judge began, his voice firm. I find in favor of the plaintiff. Eric Matthews is hereby ordered to pay the full amount of $112,000 for the repairs to the vehicle, along with additional damages for emotional distress. I sat there, frozen for a split second, as the words sank in. My mind raced as I processed the ruling. It was over. Eric was finally being held accountable for his actions. The tension in my chest that had been building for months slowly began to fade. For the first time in a long while, I could breathe. Eric's reaction was exactly what I had expected. He stood up abruptly, muttering something under his breath, his face a mask of frustration and disbelief. He didn't even look at me as he stormed out of the courtroom, the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind him with a loud bang. It was as if he couldn't accept that his world had just come crashing down. His parents were right behind him, their faces red with anger. They didn't say a word to me, but I could feel their glare burning into my back as they passed. Their attempts to shield Eric from the consequences had failed, and I could see the fury in their eyes. It was a bittersweet victory. I had won the case, but the cost of that victory was the relationship with my family. As they left, a few relatives who had attended the hearing came over to offer their support. Some of them whispered quietly, giving me reassuring pats on the back. A couple even admitted that they were proud of me for standing up for what was right, though they made sure to keep their voices low, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the room. It wasn't lost on me that many people still weren't sure how to react. Some of my family members didn't agree with my decision, and I could feel the divide growing even deeper. Walking out of the courtroom felt surreal. The sense of relief was overpowering, but so was the realization that the damage to my family was already done. There was no going back now. Even though I had made the right decision, the fallout was going to last. I couldn't pretend it didn't sting to see my family torn apart because of something that, in hindsight, seemed so simple. A stolen car, a reckless act, and a refusal to take responsibility. Yet here we were. I drove home in silence, replaying the day in my mind. The court ruling was a victory, but it felt hollow. Sure, I'd been vindicated, but I knew I had just taken a wrecking ball to my relationship with Eric, and maybe even my whole extended family. I couldn't change that now. I had done what I had to do, and I wasn't about to second-guess myself. A few weeks went by, and things didn't improve. Eric didn't make a single attempt to reach out, not even to apologize or acknowledge the verdict. It was clear he was still in denial about the whole situation. Meanwhile, the money that Eric owed me never arrived. My lawyer explained that, as expected, Eric wasn't going to just hand over the money. I'd have to go through another process to garnish his wages. It was a tedious process, full of paperwork and delays, but I was determined to follow through. I wasn't about to let him get away with this. In the meantime, I took steps to get my car repaired. I knew it would be expensive, but I also knew that repairing the car would give me a sense of closure. It was something I had worked hard for, and now it felt like I was reclaiming a part of myself, something that Eric had stolen without a second thought. When I finally picked the car up from the shop, I felt a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about fixing the vehicle, it was about regaining what had been taken from me. While I focused on getting my life back on track, the fallout within my family continued to grow. Eric's reputation began to take a hit. People who had previously dismissed his behavior started to see him for who he really was. Friends of mine, people who had been on the fence before, began to call him out for his actions. They didn't directly confront him, but there were enough whispers and subtle messages that Eric's smug confidence started to crack. At one point, Eric made a half-hearted apology on social media, but it was nothing more than an attempt to save face. He said he was sorry if anyone had been upset, but it was clear that he wasn't taking any responsibility. His words were empty, and I didn't bother responding. I knew that a real apology would never come from him, not unless he was forced to truly confront the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, some family members who had initially sided with Eric's parents started to come around. A few of them privately admitted that they were wrong, that they had been pressured into defending Eric, and that they now saw how far out of line he had gone. These small signs of support, though understated, gave me a sense of validation. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate, but people were starting to see the truth of the situation. Even though I had won the case, the journey was far from over. The legal battle had given me a sense of justice, but there was still the matter of Eric's refusal to pay. Weeks turned into months, and I heard nothing from him. It was clear he wasn't going to do the right thing willingly. My lawyer explained that the next step was to garnish Eric's wages, a process that would require more paperwork, more delays, and more frustration. It was tiresome, but it was the only way to force Eric to face the consequences of his actions. The emotional toll of the case was still lingering. Every day, I thought about how much my life had changed since that fateful day when Eric had stolen my car. The stress of the lawsuit, the alienation from my family, and the pressure of having to keep everything together had taken its toll. But one small victory kept me going. The fact that I had stood up for myself. I wasn't going to let anyone, family or not, walk all over me. I had to keep moving forward. When I finally got the car back, I felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about getting the vehicle fixed. It was about reclaiming something that had been taken from me. For the longest time, I couldn't stop thinking about how reckless and selfish Eric had been and the impact it had on my life. But now, my car was restored, and in a way, so was I. Still, the financial hit from the case was hard to ignore. Even with the car fixed, I had to deal with the lingering costs, lawyer fees, lost time, and the dent it had put in my savings. But as the months went on, things began to improve. Slowly but surely, I started to rebuild. Eric's refusal to pay only added fuel to the fire, but I wasn't going to let it define me. The family drama continued. Eric's parents, despite their earlier support, began to show signs of wear. At a family reunion a few months after the court ruling, the tension was palpable. Eric barely spoke to anyone, keeping to himself at the other end of the room. His usual cocky attitude had been replaced by something closer to avoidance. His parents, however, were a different story. They still blamed me for the rift in the family, and their glares were as sharp as ever, but even their anger was starting to lose its edge. It was like they had realized they couldn't keep defending their son's actions. Deep down, they knew he had messed up, but pride kept them from admitting it. I wasn't going to engage in their drama anymore. I had made my boundaries clear. I was no longer going to be the one to compromise in order to keep the peace. If they wanted to hold on to their grudge, that was their choice, but I wasn't going to let it drag me down any longer. My parents, who had always been supportive, stood by me. They understood why I had done what I did, and they were willing to take the heat for it, even if it meant losing touch with some family members. Their support was unwavering, and that meant more than anything to me. One surprising piece of support came from an older relative, someone who rarely got involved in family disputes. She reached out to me privately, offering a few words of wisdom. She told me that standing up for what was right often came with its challenges, but that I had done the right thing. It was a simple gesture, but it meant a lot. That small act of encouragement helped me regain perspective and reminded me that I wasn't alone in this. Through all the family tension, I began to focus more on myself. I took up new projects, reconnected with friends who had supported me from the beginning, and started looking into therapy. The idea of therapy had always seemed intimidating, but I realized that if I wanted to move forward, I had to address the emotional scars that this whole ordeal had left. Therapy helped me process the anger, frustration, and disappointment I'd been holding on to. It gave me the tools to heal. As I started focusing more on rebuilding my life, Eric's situation continued to deteriorate. His reputation had taken a nosedive. Friends who had once looked up to him began distancing themselves. Some even cut ties entirely, refusing to associate with someone who couldn't take responsibility for his actions. I didn't take any pleasure in his downfall, but I couldn't help but notice the way his life seemed to be unraveling. The same immaturity that had gotten him into trouble with me was now affecting his friendships, his work, and his reputation. At the same time, there were moments when I began to reflect on how far I had come. Despite everything, I had survived the storm. The emotional toll had been enormous, but I had learned a lot about myself in the process. For years, I had been the one to avoid conflict, always trying to keep the peace. But this experience had taught me that sometimes peace can only be achieved through accountability. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't fun, but I had stood my ground. I had held Eric accountable, and in doing so, I had shown myself what I was truly capable of. I also began to notice a shift within my family. Some of the relatives who had initially taken Eric's side started to see things from my perspective. They began to understand that it wasn't just about a car or money. It was about principles, about standing up for what's right, and about holding people accountable for their actions. The change wasn't immediate, and it wasn't total, but it was enough to give me hope. Eric's family, though, still clung to their narrative. They continued to blame me for the division in the family, but even they couldn't ignore the truth for much longer. More and more relatives began to see through the excuses, and the boys will be boys mentality that had allowed Eric to escape accountability for so long began to fade. In the end, despite everything that had happened, I couldn't help but feel proud of myself. I had done the hard thing, the right thing, even when it felt like the world was against me. It wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, about standing up for myself, and about showing that actions have consequences. And while I knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, I also knew that I was stronger for having faced them. The financial side of things was slowly improving. Eric's wages were finally being garnished, and I began receiving the payments he owed me, though they weren't coming in quickly. It wasn't a lump sum, but every payment was a step toward recovery. With time, I started to rebuild my savings. It wasn't easy, and the emotional toll lingered, but I was moving forward. I had my car back, I had my dignity, and I had the knowledge that I could face anything that came my way. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was on the right track. Months after the court ruling, the final payment from Eric finally came through. It wasn't the lump sum I had hoped for, but it was enough to close the financial chapter. The debt was paid, and I could breathe a little easier, knowing it was finally behind me. Eric's unwillingness to pay up had dragged everything out longer than it needed to be, but now I could move on. Family dynamics, though, didn't shift overnight. Some relatives who had distanced themselves began reaching out. It started with simple messages, comments on social media, texts checking in. Eventually, a few admitted they had felt pressured to side with Eric and now regretted how things had played out. That was a relief, but also a reminder of how complex family loyalty can be. Eric, for his part, seemed changed, though not in a way that made me feel any better about him. At family events, he kept to himself, avoiding direct confrontation. His usual loud, brash persona was gone, replaced by a quieter, more reserved version of himself. While this wasn't an apology, it was a sign that the consequences of his actions had sunk in. His parents still hadn't come around fully. They still thought I was too hard on Eric, that I should have just let it go, but their attempts at engaging with me felt more forced than genuine. They didn't acknowledge their role in everything, but at least there wasn't open hostility anymore. That, too, felt like progress. As for me, I focused on rebuilding my life, reconnecting with friends who had always supported me, and strengthening the bonds with family who truly cared. I started therapy to deal with the emotional toll of everything that had happened, letting go of the bitterness, and realizing I didn't need to hold on to anger to prove a point was one of the most liberating things I could do for myself. Eric reached out to me months later. It wasn't much, just a short message saying he knew he'd been wrong. It wasn't an apology, but it was a step toward growth. I accepted it, but there was no rush to forgive fully. For now, I was just focusing on the future, on moving forward without the weight of the past holding me down.